Morning, Rabbi,
Good morning.
Morning,
and
Rabbi.
everybody else.
Okay, I'm just bringing up the text. Okay, everyone see the text? Okay, so what we were talking about, good morning, everyone. What we were talking about yesterday is real estate sales. We pointed out that the concept of mishapara, he says that there's a machlokes among the poskim whether a person can have a curse of mishapara if he goes back on a real estate deal. He says, so therefore, in a situation where putting money down does not consummate the purchase, such as if you live in a locale where the deed is considered to be necessary, there would still be a mishapara after a person puts down money and then wants to go back on the deal. And then he quotes from the Chazon Ish. He says, Ula'or hanis ba'er la'el, based on what we've explained, yotzei de bizmanenu sheragilam lichtov shtar, that our practice with real estate sales is to always have paper drawn up. Lo nikna hakarka b'mos l'chud, there is no sale just by virtue of a person putting down money on real estate. Aval im kasvu gam shtar, rak lo nichtav adayin betabu. But then the question is, what happens if a deed is drawn up to represent the new ownership of the real estate, but it has not been registered with the land registry bureau? So, Kosav HaChazon Ish, de be'artzenu, she'en hamalchus makpedes al asiyah shtar zulasa, the Chazon Ish wrote about the practice in Eretz Yisrael, which would probably apply in most modern countries as well today, that the government pays no attention to the drawing of contracts unless those, for real estate purchases, unless those contracts are registered with the government. In kana bekesef, v'kasav lo shtar be'edim o b'chasim asyado. Therefore, if a person purchases a piece of real estate and paper is drawn up, and it is drawn up with witnesses or with the signature of the purchaser and the seller, afal gavdelo kasvu betabu kana, he says, even though it was not drawn up or it was not put in the land registry, nonetheless, the person's the purchase is consummated. So basically, even though, so he continues and he writes, "Filu im hisna halokeach, shahamocher tzarich limsor lo betabu." He says, even though the purchaser has stipulated that he requires the seller to register this paper, register the deed with the land registry, mikol makom im hamocher misratza limsor lo kefi shehusna, ein halokeach yachol lachzor. But if the merchant is happy to give him the deed, and give him the purchase according to the stipulated price, neither party is allowed to withdraw from the deal. The buyer can't withdraw from the deal based on the fact that it hadn't yet been registered with the land registry. V'chein im halokeach misratza beliksi v'satabu, ein hamocher yachol lachzor bo. And if the purchaser says, I don't require you to put it in the land registry, the seller is not allowed to back out of the deal. So it seems like what the Chazon Ish is saying, although it's not really clear from the language here, is that if it'll depend upon the requirements of the buyer and the seller. If the buyer says, I don't want this deal is not finalized until you register it in the land registry, nonetheless, the Chazon Ish was of the opinion that the sale is consummated regardless with the transfer of a shtar. But that's only if the buyer wants to back out. Once the seller, he says, the buyer is not allowed to back out because the seller says you can have the property even without registering it in the tabu, in the land registry. I hereby give you the property. And so once the purchaser takes possession, he can't back out. Now, what if the buyer says that I'm okay without you giving it to the land registry? Then the seller can't back out. B'chol zeh le'inyan Yisrael. And this is all having to do with two Jews engaged in real estate sales. So a lot of it will depend upon the terms of the deal. If both of them are okay with going ahead with the deal, then even before it gets registered, neither of them can back out. But it seems like from his language that if the buyer refuses to take possession before it's registered, then it sounds like then the parties are allowed to back out of the deal. But he says, but that's all with Jews. Avali mochar lenachri. But if a Jew sells property in Eretz Yisrael to a non-Jew, kasav delo kana. V'chein kasav b'shvius v'ayin sham b'bavakama dehadar b'mimasher kasav b'likutim v'hainu le'inyan nachri davka. The Chazon Ish writes that we're more lenient as far as preventing the sale when a Jew sells property to a Gentile in Eretz Yisrael, because it's much harder for that transfer to take place. Because technically, according to halacha, a Gentile is not supposed to own property in Eretz Yisrael. And therefore, until it's registered with the government, the sale is not considered to be final. But once the government acknowledges that the sale has taken place between a Jew and a non-Jew, so then no one can go back on the sale. So he says basically it depends whether it's a Jew or a non-Jew regarding tabu, regarding whether real estate sales in Eretz Yisrael, as far as registering it with the bureau or not. What would be the halacha here in Canada? We'll probably would have to speak to a real estate lawyer to find out what would be the halacha here regarding at what point is the deal considered to be finalized. But it's unclear from this that we can necessarily extrapolate halacha from the practices in Eretz Yisrael and apply them to over here. So something to explore as to at what point is a real estate deal considered to be final. We'd have to, maybe I'll ask Marvin Newman, who's a realtor.
In Canada, the final deal is actually the exchange of keys. Once it's registered, you have to actually hand over a key or hand it to the lawyer before it's closed. It's actually like technically a kinyan, yeah.
Oh, really? So what happens if the buyer doesn't take possession of the key? Is he still allowed to go back on the deal, or the seller?
No, because it has to be registered. You have to have the transfer of funds in the registry. Then the final deal is actually handing over the key.
Okay, that's what I'm asking, Avi. So what happens if everything is registered, but there's no transfer of a key?
Then technically, you don't get the house anymore, but you paid for it already.
Right. So that's what I'm saying. So what happens if there's a huge drop in the real estate prices,
Hmm.
and the buyer at that point wants to back out and say, I've decided I don't want the house, and he hasn't taken possession of the key yet. Does he have a legal right to do that and say, well, since I don't own the house yet, I'm entitled to, I want to go back on the deal?
I'm pretty sure not, because you already gave the money and it's already signed and registered.
So then of what import is the transfer of the key?
I think it's just old rules, so to speak. I don't think it's really relevant as much anymore, but technically it's not really yours until, like, you, part of closing the deal is you have to actually hand over the key, or the lawyer has to hand over the key.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, it's already registered in your name and you already paid for it already by that time. So I think it's more of like a technical olden days, this is just how we do it type thing.
But your impression is, as far as the ownership, as far as at what point can you not go back on the deal? It sounds like once up until the time of registry in the bureau.
Well, I think you can't go back on the deal once you sign the contract in Canada without paying compensation.
Without paying compensation, or without losing a deposit?
Well, either way, same type of thing, I guess.
My understanding is you lose the deposit and you have the right to sue.
Yeah.
For balance.
Yeah, that's my understanding too. As soon as the contract's drawn, if you've waived conditions and you have no more due diligence items outstanding, that's when the contract becomes legally binding. And if you pulled out at that stage, you would lose your deposit and could be sued by the other party to potentially carry through with the sale.
Okay, so it's even before it gets registered.
It's contract. It's signing a contract technically in Canada. Be your firm. Once you sign the contract, you're firm.
Right.
Then there's technicalities, and you have to pay and go through the hoops, so to speak, to technically finalize the deal.
Okay. All right. Very good.
And Rabbi, obviously from a halachic standpoint, we wouldn't distinguish between Jews and non-Jews outside of Eretz Israel, because you don't have that aspect of selling to a non-Jew the land.
Correct. So it seems like it's no different from an Eretz Yisrael. The government in Eretz Yisrael allows you to make these purchases without having it registered, and the same thing here. It's just that registering it makes it ratified by the government, but it doesn't allow either party to back out of the deal. Okay. All right. Let us go to the next section in the Imrei Yaakov. He writes the Rav Shulchan Aruch had stated that no sale is consummated with just an oral contract. Okay, and he writes in Os Beis Bidvarim Bilvad, Va'afilu heidu aleihem edim. He says this is true even if there are witnesses to the oral agreement. Va'omar hamocher, baya ze ani mocher lecha, o yayin ze ani mocher lecha. So let's say, for example, the seller says in front of two witnesses, I'm selling you this house, or I'm selling you this vat of wine, or this case of wine. Upasku hamos, and they agreed in front of witnesses that on the price. V'rotza halokeach va'omer ani kanisi, and the buyer is agreeable, and he says, yes, purchase. What do they say? Mazel bracha. The diamond guys. V'hamocher omer ani macharti, and the seller says deal. Va'amru la'edim havu aleinu edim, and they both say to the witnesses, you are witnesses to this oral deal, to this oral contract. Nonetheless, he says, where are we? Did I mix up the pages? Aleph, Beis. Mikol makom ein ze mekach hanikna, hoel v'lo haya kinyan hamoel. He says, nonetheless, this is not a final deal because there was no kinyan. So therefore, therefore legally, either party has a legal right to back out on the deal, but the party who backs out on an oral contract is still called what we call mechusar amana. Hareachozer bo bein halokeach uvein hamocher, whoever goes back on the deal, is called mimechusarei amana, is called someone who acts in poor faith. V'yesh bazeh isura. Before we get to that, what I wanted to show you was what I wanted to tell you was like this. Before we get to that idea of mechusar amana, I wanted to show you something in the Likutim. If you go back to page Aleph, Bidvarim, he says, the Likutim writes on the very bottom, which I had mentioned, is that when we go to the Likutim, he brings you case histories of specific cases. And he writes as follows: Mekach shenigmar bidvarim bilvad, o afilu haya nesinas mos sheyesh bo mishapara. Let's say there's an oral contract, or let's say there was even the exchange of money, but there was no kinyan made on the goods that were being sold. Vishuv nishtana hamatza v'ha'inyan. And then the conditions change. Okay, for example, shahakone, the buyer, kibel biyerusha osasu klisha ratza liknos. That let's say the buyer ended up getting the object that he wanted to purchase, he ended up getting it as an inheritance. So you have a situation where he's interested in purchasing a very expensive commodity. Let's say he wants to purchase a pool table. I don't know why I thought of a pool table, but let's say he wants to purchase a pool table for his house. And then all of a sudden, he discovers that his cousin passed away, and his cousin had in his estate a pool table that he left for his beloved cousin. So he now realizes that he doesn't need to purchase the pool table anymore. He just inherited a pool table. So in that situation, he's already, let's say, put down a deposit on the pool table from the merchant. Is he permitted to back out of the deal without getting the curse of Mishapara in that situation? Because the curse of Mishapara is punitively imposed on the individual who goes back on the deal. But perhaps you could argue that in this situation, the reason he's going back on the deal is for really very legitimate reasons, in that, he doesn't need one anymore, that the circumstances changed entirely. So he says, Hevi kinishtana hashar, he says that's no different from a fluctuation in market value, where we made an arrangement that we were going to sell at a certain price, and then the bottom drops out of the market. So in that situation also, the yesh omrim, the mutter lachzor, the yesh cholkim, that there's a machlokus over there between different poskim as to whether it's permissible to back out or not. I'll show you a case history from the Chassam Sofer. Let me see. I'm hoping that you're able to see it on the screen. Let me just, I'll get it. There we go. Okay. This is a tshuva from the Chassam Sofer in Choshen Mishpat. The Chassam Sofer lives in the 19th century, early 19th century, and he was one of the leading poskim of that century. And he was asked the following shaila. Higiani v'nafsho hayafa b'sheilato nidon. He says, I'm going to deliberate. You asked me to deliberate on the following question. Misha mochar chafatzav shel kesef shahayalo kidei likach b'dam of yorer levashel bo yayin saraf. He says a fellow was having an estate sale, selling off all of his assets because he needed to raise capital to purchase a still to manufacture whiskey. He wanted to go into the whiskey business, but he lacked sufficient capital to purchase a still. So he was selling off a lot of his property in order to buy a still. It was well known that was the whole reason why he was selling off so many of his assets. And he said that to anyone who was interested in buying his goods. He said, people said to him, why are you selling off all of your effects? He said, I'm trying to raise capital so I can buy a still. B'shuv terem mashach halokeach hachafotzim, va'amnam zeh kvar kibel kol ma'osav. So we had a situation where a buyer came along to buy this person's assets. The buyer gave him the money for the purchase, but he didn't yet make a kinyan on the assets. So let's say the guy is selling his whole closet full of Armani suits, okay? And the guy has not yet made a kinyan, but he put down the money, he gave the entire, let's say the guy's whole closet full was worth a couple $1,000, and the guy put down the money, and he hasn't yet made a kinyan on the suits. And then Meis Achiv Shal Mocher V'Naflo B'Yerusha Yora Kenal. And then all of a sudden, in the interim, the seller's brother passes away, and the seller realizes that I've just inherited a still because my brother had a distillery, and now I don't need to raise capital anymore because I have one. Ve'ein tzarech lo od. Al kein rotza lachzor v'shelo litein hachafotzim lahalokeach ki'im lahachzor lo ma'osa. So now he wants to go back on the deal. He wants to give the buyer his money back because he wants to keep his Armani suits. And because he doesn't need to raise the capital anymore. So what's the halacha? V'hinei hanogea le'ikar hadin kefi mashmos ha'she'ela lo haya kinyan chalipin v'lo agav karka ela kesef below meshicha. He says, now let's think about the bottom line letter of the law. He says there was only the past transfer of money. There was no kinyan made on the chattel itself, on the clothing. So there was no kinyan whatsoever. In Cain, below, because as we know, ma'os einon konos, as we have explained up until now, the transfer of cash does not consummate a deal when it comes to chattel. In Cain, below shum umdina klal yachol lachzor bo hamoche. He says, and when there was no what's called an umdina, when there was no sense of absolute reliance on the sale that was represented by either the buyer or the seller is allowed to go back on the deal. Kimavur reish simin kuf tzadiches, as is explained in the Shulchan Aruch. Ule'inyan kabolas mishapara umachusar amana. Now the question is, okay, the seller wants to go back on the deal because there was no kinyan made. Does the seller have to accept the curse of mishapara because this is the classic case of where he would accept the mishapara, or do we have a right to call him mechusar emuna, a person who acts in bad faith? So he writes, Nira vadai shinui shenishtana ha'inyan shenafalo yora b'Yerusha hava kitrei tara. He says, it seems to me that when there's a complete change in the circumstance of either the buyer or the seller, then it's like a complete change in the market value. So just like if there's a huge fluctuation in value when it comes to sales and purchases, that's a legitimate reason for either party to back out on a deal. Similarly, if a person's personal circumstances change, and as a result he wishes to go back on the deal, he has a legal right to do so, and there's no need to impose upon him a punitive curse, which is only placed upon a person because he did something improper, he did something unethical. But here, he's not acting unethically because his circumstances changed. And therefore, he cites the Ramah in Sofsim and Reish Daled, and he has a few other things to discuss in this case. But that's the case that Imrei Yaakov is making reference to in the Likutim, and it's for that reason that we have to know under what conditions Mishapara would apply, when you can say that someone is a mechusar amana, when a person is acting in bad faith. Bad faith means that he wants to go back on the deal for a frivolous reason. But if there is a legitimate circumstance which was not anticipated, and it's for that reason that he wishes to go back on the contract or go back on the deal, then we don't punish him with cursing him or by calling him a mechusar amana. Okay, so that's.
Rabbi, can I just raise one distinction between the two cases? So, in this last case we dealt with the inheritance that gives him what he really needs, that only affects the buyer. The seller is, well, it's not my fault that something happened that changed your circumstance. When market values change, that affects both the buyer and the seller. So if the price went down, he doesn't want to sell anymore. The buyer wants to buy even more because he's getting a better deal. It just affects both. And I'm not sure whether that changes anything. It's still in the mind of the buyer as to what caused it. Is it frivolous or is it a real change in circumstance? But they are kind of different in a way.
They are different. They are different. One is when there's a fluctuation in market price, a significant fluctuation that was unanticipated. And I think we'd have to assert that because market values fluctuate constantly, but what we're talking about is a very significant fluctuation in market value, which could not have been anticipated by either party. You're right. It does affect both of them, but either party does have a legitimate reason for wishing to back out.
Is this almost like a vow where we say, had I known those circumstances were going to be the case, I wouldn't have made the vow. Had I known these things, I wouldn't have made the sale. Does it have to be at that level?
Well, that is what we're talking about. Essentially, that's the explanation that either party is giving, is that it was only under certain conditions that I was prepared to complete this deal, but now those conditions have completely changed. And what essentially your distinction is correct, but apparently it doesn't make a difference in halacha. In both cases, whether one person's circumstance changes or both parties' circumstance changes because of a change in market value, each party has a right to, as long as a kinyan has not been finalized, each party has a right to go back on the deal. And as far as mishapara, it depends upon, and I guess the Beis Din would have to make this kind of evaluation, how significant have the circumstances changed to allow a person to go back on the deal, right?
But what I'm sort of comparing to is the Pesach, whatever, about annulling a vow.
I understand what you're saying. I'd rather not make analogies to vows because it's that vows is a Yoredeya issue, and we're purely here with monetary law.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, sure, of course.
Rabbi, what if there's monetary loss for one of the people involved? Like you're buying real estate, but the person fixes it up to sell or spends money on it or renovates it in order to sell, and then the person wants to back out. This person's out a lot of money. The seller is now out a lot of money.
Right. So it would seem, well, first of all, did he renovate it for the entire market or did he renovate it specifically for that buyer?
Well, if it's specifically for the buyer, I'm thinking like, for example, in my development housing, you sign a contract to buy a house. We're going to build a house for you. Then the market tanks. You don't want the house anymore. Well, we still built the house for you. Well,
but there you have a contract. So
I'm talking halachically, not.
Yeah. That's what I'm saying. Halachically, once the contract is signed, that represents a kinyan on real estate. A shtar represents a kinyan on real estate. But here we're talking about where there's been no kinyan yet. What we're talking about is, let's say you're a developer, and I come to you and I say, here's a $10,000 deposit, Avi. Do me a favor and go ahead and change the specs on the house and do the following stuff, right? And you do it because you trust me, because I'm one of your chaverim, and you don't even require me to sign any paper. And then all of a sudden, the bottom falls out, God forbid, on the real estate market, and I realize that I can't. I'm not interested in going ahead with the deal, or the buyer's circumstances change where he can't afford the house anymore. Let's say his whole business went mechula. Right, his whole business went belly up, and now he can't afford to purchase it anymore.
Yeah.
So in that situation, not only is he allowed to back out of the deal, but he is not deserving of any kind of punitive actions against him that are non-monetary, because that's really what we're talking about. We're talking about
Mhm.
non-monetary punitive action against it, which
Okay.
means, can I
So
take?
it's yeah. So it's still monetary is still allowed. Like you still have to pay compensation, so to speak, for losses that the other person takes on for you as part of the agreement.
It depends it depends whether a kinyan was made or not. That's what we're talking about. If there was, let's say there was no kinyan made.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the seller went ahead and without signing any paper went ahead and made those modifications based on just good faith, right? So does he have a case? Can he take the guy to a beis din? So it seems like that would be an interesting shaila. What level of reliance was there between the buyer and the seller that the guy was going to go ahead with the deal? The Chassam Sofer talks about this concept of umdana, which is a more advanced topic, where sometimes there's a complete reliance based upon other conditions, which we're not going to go into now. But it's not such a simple thing that just because the seller is out of pocket that he has a right to compensation if there was no kinyan made. That's the whole purpose of making a kinyan, is to make sure that both parties are protected. So the seller is protected. If he wants to invest in renovation, he should sign paper to make sure that he's fully protected, right?
Yeah.
Halachically, he might be able to pull out of the deal, but what happens to the deposit?
So it could be he would lose that deposit if the seller can demonstrate that he used that deposit money to fix up the place. It could be that he would lose that deposit. But again, we're getting ahead of ourselves. We haven't seen any of these halachas inside. So we're just looking at certain concepts as far as when is the person entitled to have the curse of Mishpat imposed upon him. So that's what we saw for today. When legitimate circumstances change, then a person has a right to not have the curse of Mishpat imposed upon him. And we're going to hold it here for today. And Hashem tomorrow.
Have a good day, everyone. Stay well.